Hello, class. So let's see. I was trying to do this video earlier today, and I was having some problems with the wind, and I tried to record it inside. And then as I was recording it, I realized, hey, it would probably be better just to do a screencast. So that's why I'm doing a screencast, because I feel that the type of attention that I give this also should help to understand the quality of time and consideration I want you to give this as well, right? So, in other words, this is done in the name of clarity, really, okay? And then so know that some of the issues that I'm touching on here are a little bit, could be considered sensitive, but again, we're in an ethics class and we're trying to take these things into consideration by light of the COVID pandemic. And so understand that I'm not presenting this so that I'm forcing you to take sides or anything like that. All I'm really doing is assigning this as a way to understand how we're understanding a particular vantage by way of ethics, okay? So I wrote this at the onset of lockdown right around March, and I still think that it's some of the concerns are applicable today, and you'll see why. So the ethical problems of, so I want you to read this Garrett Hardin, of course, and in the a video that accompanies the assignment, I have an analysis of a little more in-depth analysis of Garrett Hardin as well. And so I'll be posting this screencast on right here and with our assignment and also in the content folder there. Okay, so the ethical problems of COVID pandemic in relation to population issues. So now to draw our focus on the COVID-19 pandemic and its related ethical problems, issues, and possible solutions, our angle will now be the controversial aspects of the reintegration of the economy as we continue to face the omnipresent threat of increasing viral infection tied to obvious ethical and environmental connections. This concern has us carefully wondering about the ethical quandary of public health versus the health of the economy. This is one critical issue we confront as we are up against all the big unknowns and uncertainties of this deadly virus. So then the point then is we have these overlapping issues, the economy, also health, also our ethics. Okay, so that's a little bit of what we're getting, well, not a little bit, but a lot of what we're getting into here. Okay, so as you see this sentence, this concern has us carefully wondering about the ethical quandary of public health versus the health of the economy. In other words, this might be something that's versus, but in the same sense, it might also be something that's combined. So our ethical framework is a way in which we're situating this dichotomy here, public health and the health of the economy. So how is it that we're thinking of the economy, public health in terms of ethics as well, right? So we must do the right thing, yet we do not always know what the right thing to do is. Our best conscientious intuition is to be as cautious as possible in the name of public health for individuals and for the sake of the general population. Public health is our shared priority, and we rely on health experts to guide our decisions thereof. But how does ethical philosophy fit into all this? In other words, we have an understanding that we need to do right when we're thinking of the pandemic, yet at the same time, we also have ethical concerns that are not announced. So in other words, We know that we need to do good, yet at the same time, are we clear on our ethical framework, right? And then likewise, how that's understood in practice by way of our management of our own health in relation to public health as well, okay? So our health and economic concerns line up with ethical thinking because the experts utilize ethics to guide their health and economic recommendations. Okay. Now, whether these ethics are clear to whoever it is that is guiding our health and economic recommendations also remains to be seen, right? In other words, sometimes people are not always clear on their ethical positions, right? And that could lead to oversights and misunderstandings in terms of our priorities. So even as we consider the science, we need to call attention to what often gets overlooked because we presume the ethical theory more often than we put the ethical theory into specific clarity, okay? So good and bad ethics are usually implicit and unannounced in our scientific public health discussions because more often than not, we assume everyone is aiming for goodness in the same way we are. We rarely announce our ethical theory out loud unless we are taking an ethics class. So these points can't be overemphasized. In other words, what we take to be implicit is something that if we only take it as implicit and we don't take into consideration how it's working or how it's understood, then we run the risk of misunderstanding what we're doing ourselves. So this is an important consideration given that what we consider to be common knowledge often needs closer scrutiny and evaluation. If we are unaware of our theoretical strategy, we cannot effectively assess our ethical tactics. It becomes tough to know what the right thing to do is because we usually ignore the implications of our ethics when we think such a philosophical practice is isolated to the classroom or to be found in a book somewhere. In other words, students often think that philosophy is a bunch of theoretical mumbo-jumbo, and they forget that the way that philosophy is getting us to think is that it's a way in which we organize our practice. In other words, it's the way in which we organize our understanding of how it is that we're working ethically in the world, okay? So in sum, as much as we rightfully cherish the role of science to help us through the pandemic, we should not ever forget the underlying ethics that inform our scientific and economic practices, right? That in other words, when we're favoring science and economic practice, there's nothing wrong with that. But yet at the same time, we might call into question an idea of prioritizing these two disciplines above and beyond health concerns, okay? So in other words, how is it that our health concerns, our scientific understanding, and I didn't even include our political practice and our economic practices, how do these overlap by way of our ethical practice, right? And likewise, how does that work? What is it that we're thinking of that's important to take into consideration, right? Trying to look at the time here, I could barely see it. Because of the drastic effect the pandemic has on the population, ethical problems stand in stark relief. The nature of the pandemic has us thinking a lot about percentages of the population who contract the virus and die. We see that the percentage of people who actually die from the virus is relatively low, in contrast to the people who will contract the virus who will not die. In other words, we can think of this descriptive account of the way that the coronavirus is understood in terms of percentages that will be affected in terms of death and in relation to the percentage of people who will contract the virus and not die, right? And I think that that dynamic is a part of how it is that we understand this ethically, right? So in other words, this elementary view whereby we could reduce the percentage of people as low here in the way that we're thinking of mortality. So we might be willing to sacrifice the few for the happiness and well-being of the many who do not die from the virus, okay? So trust me, this is not my view per se, but it's a vantage that can be taken, okay? So keep in mind, this view does not always consider that even if we do not die from contracting the virus, we are still infectious, and we and countless others still could be unknowingly affected, needing hospitalization, compromising our long-term health, so on and so forth. In other words, in the name of public health, we still need to be as safe as possible, right? So that's a little in contrast to this idea that there's a willingness to sacrifice the well-being of a few for the many, which should sound familiar as utilitarian. Now, don't get distracted with that utilitarian element, because what I'm wanting students to do is start thinking about how it is that that perhaps is straying from goodness. Okay, so I just want you to start thinking of that. So let's see. This line of reasoning has a few people wondering if the suffering and deaths of the few is worth the lockdown for the many. We want to get back to work, but how soon is too soon? What kind of ethical gamble are we willing to make for public health? Is it worth the cost? What are we willing to sacrifice? So that's really the main push here. This next paragraph here is focusing on how it is that the COVID pandemic could also have population issues in a different way, by way of encroachment of people into habitats of wild animals, and then also decreasing standards of living around the world's poor and vulnerable, having to do with the world's poor and vulnerable, and also interaction with wildlife, right? And how is it that this is bringing about this problem with zoonotic spillovers that is increasing as we are thinking of this by way of not only climate change, but also overpopulation issues, okay? So I focus on the utilitarianism here, but don't get distracted with that, okay? And as a matter of fact, it might be a way in which you could argue against it, or in the name of the good, by way of traditional utilitarianism itself, negative utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, feminism, ethics of care, or natural law theory. So I think we'll just stop here, and I'm going to make another screencast to talk about these two arguments, okay? So we'll take it from there. Thanks.